Good day, students. You're welcome to another interesting time with Mrs. Odiase. It's time for your biology class. Okay, we have been looking at tissues and supporting systems for a while now. We have talked about so many things. We have talked about the skeleton as the supporting system found in animals. We have been able to define the skeleton as the structure that gives animals shape, rigidity, and support. We've talked about the various functions of the skeleton, some of which are for protection, for movement, etc. etc. We have talked about the materials that make up the skeleton. We have talked about the three different types of skeleton. The hydrostatic skeleton as found in worms like earthworm. We have talked about the exoskeleton as found in animals like the insects, and the endoskeleton as found in vertebrates. Then we have talked about the mammalian skeleton and how that the mammalian skeleton is made up of two parts. The axial skeleton made up of the skull, the ribs, sternum, vertebral column, then also the appendicular skeleton made up of the limbs and the limb girdles. Okay, we have talked about the several bones that make up the bones of the vertebral column, the different vertebrae, cervical vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae, sacral and caudal vertebrae. We have talked about all of this. Today we're going to be talking about something slightly different but a bit related. We're talking about joints. We're going to be talking about joints. What is a joint? Simply put, a joint is a place where two or more bones meet. A joint is a place where two or more bones meet. So any place where two bones or more than two bones meet, we call that place a joint. Now, there are different types of joints in the body. Okay, so before we talk about the types of joints, I would like to talk about two things: the articulating surface of a joint, as well as the meaning of ligament. Okay, the articulating surface of a joint is the surface where the joint is. That's the surface of the joint is known as the articulating surface. The surface of any joint at all is the articulating surface. And this articulating surface usually is covered by hyaline cartilage. We've talked about three different types of cartilage: the elastic cartilage, hyaline cartilage, and fibrocartilage. So the articulating surface of most bones are covered with hyaline cartilage. This serves to reduce friction between the bones at that joint, as well as to minimize the wear and tear that could result from friction. Okay, so bones are held together by ligaments. Ligaments are fibrous connective tissues. These fibrous connective tissues bind bones together at joints. So bones are held together firmly by fibrous connective tissues known as ligaments. Joints also have a synovial membrane. This synovial membrane produces synovial fluids which act as lubricants to lubricate the joints and also act as shock absorber for the bones. Okay, so back to the types of joints. There are two main types of joints: the immovable or fixed joints and the movable or synovial joints. The immovable or fixed joints are joints that have bones that are fused together by sutures. These sutures are saw-like edges, as we find in the skull. Okay, examples of immovable joints are the bones in the skull, the joints we have in the skull, in the sacrum, and then the pelvic girdle. Now, movable joints are joints that permit different forms of movement from one point or from one direction to another. There are five main types of movable joints. These are the ball and socket joint, the hinge joint, the gliding joint, the pivot joint, and the saddle joint. We will take each of these one after the other. So the first type of movable joint is the ball and socket joint. The ball and socket joint is a type of joint that involves movement in all directions, that is 360 degrees wise. This joint involves bones that have a round head called the ball and another having a hollow cavity called the glenoid cavity, which usually is cup-like. And this glenoid cavity or cup-like that is cup-like shaped is called the socket. So the head of one bone and the socket of another usually forms a perfect connection, which gives rise to the name ball and socket joint. Examples of ball and socket joints occur at the hip joint and is between the femur and the pelvic girdle. Then another example is the shoulder joint between the scapula and the proximal end of the humerus. So we have examples of ball and socket joints as the joint that occurs between the proximal head of the femur and the pelvic girdle, that's the hip joint, and then between the proximal head of the humerus and the scapula, that is at the shoulder. These are examples of ball and socket joints. The next type of joint is the hinge joint. The hinge joint. The hinge joint is a joint involving bones that have direct contact and make a movement in only one direction, like the opening and closing of a door. Usually, this movement is in 180 degrees. The elbow joint forms a connection between the humerus articulating with the radius and the ulna, and also the knee joint between the femur and the fibula and tibia. These are examples of the hinge joints. The hinge joint, examples of the hinge joint are joints of the knee and the joints at the elbow. The joint at the knee forms a connection between the distal head of the femur and then the tibia and the fibula. That's the joint at the knee. Then the joint at the elbow between the distal head of the humerus and the radius and the ulna. These are examples of hinge joints, elbow joints, and knee joints. The next kind of joint is the gliding joint. The gliding joint. The gliding joint permits the gliding or the sliding of one bone over another. Usually, this movement is slight and the bones are held together this time by fibrocartilage. Examples of these joints are found in the wrist and in the ankle, between the bones of the carpals and the bones of the tarsals. So the bones of the carpals glide over one another, then the bones of the tarsals as well glide over one another. So examples of gliding joints are joints in the wrist and in the ankle. Then the next type of joint is the pivot joint. The pivot joint. The pivot joint allows a rotational movement between the atlas and the axis in the neck. This gives rise to the rotation and the nodding of the head. This is a slight movement as well, which just permits a slight rotation and a nodding in the neck. Then the last type of joint is the saddle joint. The saddle joint. The saddle joint is found in very rare places, and usually it allows it's more like an extensor flexor movement, the opening and closing, but it's slightly different. Okay, it is found between the end of the thumb bone and the last type of movable joint we'll be looking at is the saddle joint. The saddle joint. The saddle joint got its name from observing the shape of the bones that articulate at the joint. One of them usually is concave in shape, concave or turned inwards, while the other is convex or turned outwards. So when these two bones come together, they make a connection and a perfect fit. This kind of movement is slight and it's more like a, a flexor and extensor movement. Okay, we can observe the bones of the thumb, that's the distal end of the phalanx of the thumb articulating with the metacarpal. So we have that joint as a saddle joint, where we have the distal end of one phalanx at the thumb and the metacarpal as an example of a saddle joint. Another example of saddle joint is the end of the clavicle, the proximal end of the clavicle articulating with the upper part of the sternum. So we have the end of the clavicle articulating with the upper part of the sternum. That's another example of a saddle joint. So going over what we have been discussing today, we have talked about the joint as the place where two or more bones meet. We have looked at the articulating surface of a joint as the surface where these bones meet. Okay, we have looked at ligaments as the fibrous connective tissues that binds bones together at joints. Then we have looked at two major types of joints: the immovable or fixed joints, as found in the skull, in the ilium, and other places. Then we have also looked at synovial or movable joints, and we have said that there are five different types of synovial joints: the ball and socket joint, the hinge joint, the gliding joint, the pivot joint, and lastly, the saddle joint. Thank you.